Welcome to Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers. Journey with us as we navigate the winding path into tree and plant-related careers with professionals who have taken root or are still branching out. I'm Megan Wiesbrook.
And I'm Jessica Turner-Scoff.
On our episode today, we're discussing important traits to have or develop in STEM careers. And our trait today is innovation. Joining us is Chris Martine, the Burpee Professor of Plant Genetics and Research at Bucknell University and the host of a YouTube series, Plants Are Cool Too.
Hey, it's great to be on.
Chris, as the host of Plants Are Cool Too, what has been the most memorable experience you've had as a host?
We had a recent episode where we discovered a really rare plant on a cliff while rappelling, so hanging on ropes. And the discovery was made only because I tweeted a picture of this plant and got the identification wrong. So we had this episode that we were shooting hanging off of ropes and then made this great discovery through the use of social media. So it hit on a lot of things that I'm into.
I think from what you just said, it's not only plants are cool too, but plant scientists are cool too, because that's awesome.
Yeah, they are actually really cool.
That sounds like a whole lot of fun. I am deathly afraid of heights, so the rappelling part kind of makes my heart race a little bit. We have a couple items here that we're going to link together that all relate to you, but we want to give our listeners a chance to kind of get to know a little bit about you before we jump into talking about innovation. So Can you connect with us a rabbit named Harvey, the movie The Martian, and Australia?
Yeah. When I was a little kid, I spent a thunderstorm in an arborvitae bush holding a pet rabbit named Harvey. And to this day, I can still smell the arborvitae. I can smell the rabbit. I can smell the sort of electricity of that thunderstorm. And it gave me the same feeling that I get when I do a lot of the cool remote field work I get to do now as part of my job. And a lot of that happens in Australia. And in the last few years, we discovered a new plant that we actually named. We discovered in Australia and named it for Mark Watney, the lead character in The Martian. So the link there is that somehow my former pet rabbit Harvey is connected in some way to Matt Damon.
Oh man, and I love that story of you with Harvey, because it's one of those really powerful stories of something from childhood that sticks with you. And I'm sure that the experience with those plants, maybe in a small way, it is where you are now and what you're doing that connected you there.
Could be.
And now we're really excited to hear more about, your experiences and how you developed your trait of innovation, because you do so many cool things. You're a professor, you're a major science communicator, and we're really excited to talk to you today about what you do to inspire people and how you think about innovation.
So, Chris, why don't we get started with kind of learning a little bit more about your career and where you started and where you are now. I don't know if it was in the arborvitae with your pet Harvey, but was there a moment when you knew you wanted to work with plants, or kind of take us back to the beginning?
Yeah, I spent a childhood outdoors. I was really lucky. I was out in nature for a lot of the time that I was a kid, but I had no understanding that a person could sort of do nature, be a person who studies nature in their life. That's something that didn't really hit me until I got to college. And I was a first-gen college student. I didn't know scientists growing up. I didn't know PhDs or professors growing up. So when I met those people as a student at Rutgers, it kind of blew me away that there were these people that got to do this as a job. And not only were they teaching people about it, but they were also sort of discovering new information. And that was a really exciting finding for me. And as I took more and more courses in ecology and evolutionary biology in particular, that's when I really began to see sort of the natural world around me quite differently. I realized that everywhere we were going on these cool field trips, the plants were really the backbones of these systems and these natural communities. And that's when it really sort of hit me that understanding the plants that are here in the world is sort of this entry into understanding the whole world sort of as an entity. So I think that's where I sort of started getting hooked on plants. But I was probably 20 at that point. So maybe you might call me a bit of a late bloomer. Yeah.
So you say it was around 20 that you became really focused on plants, but when did you start really trying to expand your world into like the education sphere?
Yeah. I think the first A I ever got in college was in a dendrology course. Soon after I started discovering I really was passionate about ecology and evolution. This is a course that was sort of tree biology and tree identification. And getting an A in that course meant you were eligible to apply for to be a TA in the course in the following year. And I got that job as a TA and loved it. And I just sort of this enthusiasm that I was developing for science, everything I was learning just blew me away because I just, this is all really new to me and exciting to me. And I wanted other people to feel that same sensation. So I realized that sort of teaching was this way to do that, right? And when I graduated, I got a job as a K through 12 educator, first with the New Jersey Forest Service and later with the Mercer County Soil Conservation District, and then I really learned how to be a teacher. I was going into classrooms and I was meeting students in the woods, and really had to hold their attention and be enthusiastic about science, which I already was, but also figure out ways to teach them some pretty complex stuff. And when I saw people get that and have these same kind of eureka moments that I had as a student, I was totally hooked. I wanted to do that for the rest of my life.
I understand the feeling. As a former educator myself, those moments when what you're so excited about translates well to getting other people just as excited, and kind of watching that process happen is definitely invigorating. I would say
it is. It's a drug you can't kick, really.
I know this one is hard, but it will kind of give our listeners an idea of the breadth of your career. But could you summarize your career in a sentence for us?
I get to discover cool stuff and tell people about it.
Perfect.
That's pretty much my career.
Isn't it fun to think about like all of the years of your education, all of your background, and that just so succinctly tells that story? That's great. I love it. So what's your formal education background? Where'd you go to school?
Yeah, I did a bachelor's at Rutgers University, Cook College, and that's in natural resource management, conservation biology focus. I then did a master's also at Rutgers in ecology and evolution. And then I went on to do my PhD. After a break, I worked for a while, and then I went back to get my PhD at the University of Connecticut, and that degree is in botany. So 3 degrees. I finished. I didn't even start my PhD until I was 30. So again, it took me a while to come around to all this, but I'm pretty darn happy with where it's taken me.
So with all of those different steps and kind of places where you made a pivot or took another step in another direction, kind of following your interest, did you have any especially influential mentors that kind of helped guide your path to the different opportunities or next steps that you took?
Yeah, I mean, as an undergrad, I had incredible professors who helped me see the world in a totally different way. One of those was named Roger Lacandro. I did 2 field-based courses, one with him, one in Newfoundland, and one in Alaska. 5-week courses that really just totally shifted my whole worldview. And then later, when I went to do my PhD, my advisor, Greg Anderson, was just a huge mentor, and I see a lot of things in how I operate day to day that I know came from watching him, right, and being guided and taught by him. So they've been pretty important to me.
It's really neat hearing about how you had these experiences, with your field courses in Alaska and Newfoundland, and you had these amazing opportunities. You did research, and now you are really involved with, helping undergraduates experience scientific research. So can you talk a little bit about how you help facilitate that, and is that based on your own background and experience?
Yeah, I think it is. I've thought a lot about this because I see, I spend some time on social media, including Twitter, sort of seeing what people have to say about student mentoring. And there's all these people with such amazing ideas for how to do it really well. And I guess I've always sort of thought about it in a particular way. I've been a little bit less concerned with every student coming through my lab having an outcome that is a sort of measurable as a traditional metric, right? Like not every scientific outcome has to be successful, however you define that. And much more, I think much more about the students themselves going through some sort of learning process, right? So one of the things I often tell the people that I co-mentor students with, I have postdocs in the library often that are amazing with students, and I often say that, like, there's a lot of times where the project, the scientific project, is not really the project. It's more like the student is the project, right? And I think that's sort of this sort of way that I've operated for the years I've been a professor, is that every student who comes into my lab and says I might want to do undergraduate research, at that moment they themselves become a project in a lot of ways, right? And so that's where I often start. And then if there are outcomes like publications and presentations, then that's also amazing, right? But I want to know that they've grown in some way, and that's kind of how I've always looked at it.
Very cool. We've talked a lot about, kind of your path into research and your educational background, but we have not yet touched upon something that both Jessica and I are major fans of.
It's awesome.
I will not let her sing the theme song.
Don't worry. I'm not going to. That's very clear.
Although I do catch her humming it quite often, so there is that. But can you tell us what inspired you to create your YouTube series, Plants Are Cool Too?
Yeah, sure. And at this point, that's about 10 years ago that we started this project. It's something that I do with two professional videographers, filmmakers, Paul Frederick and Tim Kramer. And somewhere around a decade ago, I was at the time doing I was sort of running with my wife Rachel these summer field biology camps up in the Adirondack region, and I was out every day with children in the forest talking about nature, and often we'd run into something, an animal, and they would know all about it, and then I'd have to teach them all the plants that were around them because they didn't know much at all about the plants and the things around, the green things around them. And I would ask these students, how do you know this stuff? And they were getting a lot of their knowledge at the time from at that time watching television, right? And increasingly it became YouTube videos as well. But they were getting all this really dynamic visual content, video content about animals, but there wasn't much of it available for plants. So I decided I needed to make a video series that sort of did that for plants, that presented not just cool plants, but also, as you mentioned earlier, the cool scientists that work on them, and sort of highlighting those two things has been the mission of that series ever since.
And you go all over with that series too, which is really cool.
Yeah, it's been pretty awesome. Yeah, we get to mostly so far all in the U.S., but yeah, we've done really awesome stuff in the southwestern deserts and in fossil beds in Idaho and bogs and in Louisiana. So yeah, we get to do some cool stuff.
Chris, we just want to touch a little bit more on that trait innovation. So, you've found so many innovative ways to communicate your science. And, it's not just the awesome YouTube series, Plants Are Cool Too, but you do a lot of other different ways to engage people with science. So can you talk about innovation as your skill?
Yeah, I've thought a lot about this too, because it feels to me like a lot of the stuff that I was doing just a few years ago and thinking I was sort of on this cutting edge of communicating science is what a lot of people are doing now, right? So there's just tons of awesome, engaging, often junior scientists doing amazing scientific communication work right now. And I think one of the things that kind of has followed me, and I think that I really see manifested in a lot of this type of communication now, is that there's this willingness to kind of be casual and be a little bit informal and just be a real person, right? I think that the sort of typical idea of what a scientist is and how a scientist acts is something that can be off-putting for the general public and especially for perhaps children, younger people. So, I kind of think that as a first-gen college student, as a first-gen scientist, as somebody who came from a non-traditional path, in a lot of ways, I'm kind of an innovation, right? And I think a lot of other people that are coming from similar, different directions are also in themselves really the innovation. And so by just being real people and being out there and being okay with being casual and sometimes using casual language and being a little bit informal, that's okay. And that's the way that I've sort of chosen to be a science communicator, and it's, to be honest, the way that I've chosen to really be a scientist.
That really resonates with people when you're your true, authentic self. And I think that's one of the reasons that your videos and, the podcasts that I've heard you be on, I mean, you really are this authentic person, and it's great.
Well, I appreciate you saying that. I mean, I find myself often in outreach situations where I'm, especially with younger people, where I'm sometimes the first scientist or first PhD or first professor that a kid has ever met, right? And if I come in there and I sort of fulfill their expectations of sort of the lab coat wearing, very serious, white male scientist who's inaccessible to them, right? Then that doesn't help anybody, right? So I'm really cognizant of this sort of desire to be accessible and to be someone that people can look to and say, oh, okay, maybe I could be that person someday.
I love listening to that viewpoint because it's, the Plants Are Cool 2 series coming out of, kind of a need that you thought, for this audience in a way that maybe hasn't been done before. Essentially, that's where a lot of great ideas are born, is when you are, working with a group or you kind of see this need and you wonder, how can I get this to them? How can I tackle this? So it's a great viewpoint. It's something that Jessica and I share, and kind of how we thought about coming up with this podcast. It's very similar. So we can definitely relate to that. And I really applaud your work in making science more accessible for youth, because, it starts to humanize scientists so that they're more relatable, and also, inspire others to consider something that they maybe thought was completely out of reach. So super exciting. We also know that you recently won the Peter Raven Award for individuals who are involved in engaging others in botany. And this is, largely because you work in communicating science, but you also balance scholarship, teaching, service, and outreach. So can you talk a little bit about what drives you to find new ways to communicate with others and what that looks like?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, there's a lot of things we could point to as sort of like us being in crisis, but one of the things that we are certainly in is a biodiversity crisis. It saddens me. It's heartbreaking to me that there are things disappearing every day before we even know they're there, right? We don't have a name for them. We don't know their role in the ecosystems. These ecosystems could be breaking down because things are disappearing, and yet these are things we don't even know about, right? So one of the things that really drives me is I want more and more people to appreciate the world that we're in and all these things we share the planet with, and maybe even inspire people to sort of join this team of people who get to go out and discover things, right? Assign names to things, learn about their biology, and help protect habitats and communities and ecosystems that we all depend upon. So that's really what drives me to tell more and more people about these things, because I think people just need to know.
I do have a question related to this, though, too. A lot of times, we kind of walk this fine line of balancing, fear with, not being too overwhelming, not having, inciting, I don't want to say ecophobia, but when we have these really large environmental problems, kind of messaging that in a way that isn't, I don't want to say too scary, but doesn't kind of like, oh, it's too big of a problem, I can't solve it, and doesn't, gets at real, I don't want to say positive ways of spinning the problem, but ways that people can feel engaged. So what kind of stories do you have that come out of, that you feel have really great impact when you're trying to convince people that plants are cool too? That kind of gets away from that, like, oh, this is too big of a problem.
Gloom, which just has been shown to like shut people off.
Yeah, I'm definitely not on that side. I feel like everybody's got a role to play in sort of getting the messaging out there. And my role is definitely like just telling people that there's awesome stuff out there. My entire Twitter presence is basically like, OMG, this is so awesome. So that's kind of the role I feel like I've sort of taken on. And I think the video series, there's a lot of that too. We do often talk about like why these things matter, but I think the big push is These things are incredible. These things are right out there. All you have to do is get to the right place and you can see amazing things. All you have to do is go out in your own backyard and you can see amazing things. And I think just sort of helping people to see the things around them in a way that they've never been trained to see or never been taught to see is this huge step, right? This sort of developing an appreciation for what's out there. And then when you talk about loss, things that we're losing, right, then you're invested, right? So I feel like I'm on sort of the front end, like help people understand how cool everything is. And then when they hear later, all that cool stuff that you now know about could be lost, well, then they feel like they have skin in the game.
Now, I love how you talk about just going out in your backyard and, seeing the cool things that are out there. But that's like your skill set is being able to go out there and see what's different, see what's unique, because that's what you do is you discover new plant species, which is awesome. And I'm hoping that you can talk a little bit about that and, what are some of the species you've discovered and named and, how do you decide to name a species? Because, I think that it's something that I think that a lot of people would not really realize that we're still discovering things. We're still learning. It's this huge untapped world out there. And it's really cool. And I think that we should talk about it.
Yeah, it is cool. I mean, we're still discovering new things every single day, right? Science is discovering and naming new things every single day, which is amazing, right? And it is one of those things that not everybody understands. I find that people get really excited when they read stories about new species discoveries, and I think that's awesome. But it also says a lot about how a lot of us don't really understand how much there is still left to be discovered. So that's sort of a message I'm always hammering on. As you said, I've been really lucky, right? Myself and my colleagues, we've spent so much time learning about this one particular group of plants in Australia that are called bush tomatoes. They're in the genus Solanum. They're closely related to eggplants. And getting to know this group of species, mostly in northern Australia, over the last 20 years means that now I know it so well that when we're out in these remote places or we see something in a museum collection, right, that is odd, I can look at that and say, oh, yeah, that might be a new species, right? And then we get to sort of dig deep into it and try to build the evidence for naming this as something new. So it is something we get to do that's been really fun. And, in terms of how we decide to name things and what we name them, well, that's all sort of part of the traditional peer review process, right? We have to build the data set and provide the evidence so that when these things get sent out as journal articles, that the community of scholars looks at it and says, okay, we believe you. We think you've presented a compelling case for naming this as something new. And that's awesome when it happens.
So cool. So exciting.
It's amazing.
We do have one last question about innovation. How is it that you find, or what are some innovative ways that you balance both a career and a family?
Yeah, it's hard and doesn't always work, right? And there's been lots of ways I've not done it well, and then there are probably occasional ways that it's gone okay. For me, my favorite example right now is that my daughter and I are currently in the cast of our local production of Mamma Mia at our local community theater.
Oh, fun.
So trying to sort of carve out time to do fun things like that is I think key for me. And I have to admit that it was my daughter who said, "Hey, Dad, we should do this together," and she dragged me down to the audition, and now we're both
great.
In a musical. Yeah,
that's so great.
Yeah. So I don't know. I'm glad she got me to do it because often it takes a little bit of cajoling to get it, to really find work-life balance.
Oh, for sure.
Yeah. But I think it's definitely something that's important to talk about. And, I know that when I was growing up, I thought that if you were in science, you probably couldn't have a family. Yeah. And so it's one of those things that I think it's nice to know that you can have it all, as they say.
Dangerous language.
Yeah, I know, right? Well, we recently had teachers on site at a workshop, and we showed them your profile and asked them, what questions would they like to ask you? And so one of the questions that came out was, how do you balance your research and your outreach?
That is a really fair question because the Plants Are Cool 2 series is not about my own work. It's about promoting other people's work and the plants that they are studying. So it's really an outward-facing thing. And so in that case, it's not balancing my own research with outreach. But the way that I've tried to sort of achieve that balance more so is that myself and my lab group and the postdocs I'm lucky enough to work with, the scientific outcomes that sort of emerge from our lab are always seen through this lens of, okay, what's the story? Is there a story here that we can do something with? So we've been really active in sort of picking out the narratives from the discoveries that we're making and writing our own press releases and working closely with communications offices, both here at our institution and in the journals that we're publishing in. And so I think, so my passion for outreach can be met by thinking about our own work in ways that we might amplify the stories that we have coming out of our work.
Very cool. Very exciting. I also know when we showed your profile to our group of educators, they noticed that, a lot of the discoveries that you've made or even a lot of your work and research has taken you to Australia. So can you share a little bit about your most memorable expedition in Australia?
Yes, I've done, I guess, 7 trips in the last 12 years, and the one that stands out the most was 2014 because my wife Rachel and our kids Izzy and Jackson, we all went together on that trip, and our cousin Aaron, and we were all there together for 6 weeks, living out of a truck and a couple of tents. It was just amazing. But on that trip, we had, I think, the experience that we'll all remember forever. Was walking through Tunnel Creek out in the Kimberley region of Western Australia, and this is a cave about maybe a half mile long that runs underneath an ancient reef formation. So it's this big limestone formation, a mountain, and there's a creek that runs underneath the mountain and comes out on the other side. So the whole time you're walking through this tunnel, this cave, you're in like anywhere from knee deep to waist deep water, and for the most part, except for a couple places where the roof is caved in, it's pitch dark, right? So we walked through this. It was sort of harrowing. You got headlamps on. It was fun. We knew we'd come out on the other end eventually. Mm-hmm. And when we came out on the other end, we realized that the only way back to where our vehicle was to basically turn around and do the whole thing again. You couldn't just hike back over the top of this limestone mountain. Mm-hmm. And we thought, well, okay, I guess we got to do that again. That was fun. Let's do it. And as we turned our headlamps back to the inside of the cave, we caught all these sort of almost like little, like flashing little light bulbs all across the surface of the water. And Rachel said, "What are those?" And I said, "I'm not sure what you're talking about." And then she pointed her headlamp, and we realized it was crocodile eyes.
Oh, my gosh.
The entire cave was full of freshwater crocodiles. And we had just not only walked through that tunnel full of crocodiles, but we knew that our only way back to our vehicle was to do it again. And this time we knew they were there. So,
that's terrifying.
So we made it. We did make it.
I'm sure that was the longest hike back to your car.
It was rough. Yeah, it was rough.
Especially as a parent, like that fear. Oh my gosh. One thing that we wanted to touch base a little bit is about how you went about naming the Australian blood-bone tomato, because that is a really cool plant that you discovered, and really, going back to innovation, but a really innovative way that you named it.
Yeah, the Australian blood-bone tomato, the Latin name is Solanum ossicruentum. This is a species that that was actually the collections that we needed to name this were made on the trip with my family, even though it had been sort of thought about by field botanists for a long time as being something that needed some work and was probably distinctive. And so when we had that thing ready to go, we still needed to choose a name. I went over to the local middle school and had an assembly with 150 7th grade students and their teacher, Brad Catherman, and we challenged those students to come up with a name. So I did a big presentation. I showed them live plants, and then every student wrote an essay in which they chose a Latin name and then justified that name as the one we should choose. And in the end, we went with Solanum ossicruentum as inspired by actually a couple of different students who got stuck on a couple of really cool characteristics of the plant.
That's great. That's a great way to get the community involved and have those kids have an experience with plants that they'll never forget.
It was really fun. It's been a few years since we did that, and those students are all in the high school now, and I still see them around town occasionally, and they still talk about it. They talk about like how cool it was to help name this plant, and so it really has been a fun thing in the community.
Well, that's an excellent transition because, Chris, why are plants cool?
Well, first of all, I'm looking out my window right now, and they're everywhere, right? Everywhere I look, I see green, this big wall of green all around me. So they're pretty darn important. They're driving so much of what's going on in the whole global system, and they're always present, right? There's always something to learn. In fact, after we talk, I'm probably going to go outside and stare at a tree, and I might see something I haven't seen before, right? So they really are the best.
Well, you don't need to convince us. We are already converted.
Choir over here.
We do have one last question. This is a tough one. If I had to guess, I would guess that your answer will be from the family Selenium. But can you tell me a little bit about what is your favorite plant and why?
It is generally an impossible question, but your timing is good right now because we have a new species that is about to come out in the journal Phytokeys within the next couple of weeks, and it's a species we are calling Solanum plastisexum, and it's my favorite for a lot of reasons, not just because it's new right now, but one of the things that's neat about this plant is that for decades, field botanists have seen this in the wild, and had a really hard time figuring out what was going on with it. It was very difficult to identify the reproductive system of this plant because depending on when you ran into it, it was all male or all female or all bisexual. And so there was a lot of fluidity going on in terms of the plant's sexuality, and that made it difficult to nail down what was going on with this plant. We are acknowledging that in the naming of this plant, plastisexum, and also pointing to it as a really good example for why any notion of binary sexuality among Earth's living creatures is kind of a fallacy, right? I mean, when it comes to sexuality and how things present in that way, it's all across the board, and what's really normative is variability and inconstancy, and it's all okay as far as we're concerned. So that's sort of the story we're telling by naming this species as we are.
Well, I'm very excited to read that paper that will be published about it, and just to continue to learn about the species that you discover throughout your career.
Thanks so much.
And Chris, just thank you for being on this episode. I think you're a fantastic example of the trait innovation. You are a modern scientist who has broken that ivory tower. You are so credentialed, you are so personable, and you are finding really cool and innovative ways to spread the good word that plants are cool too. So thank you so much, Chris.
Oh, gosh, thank you. And I love what you guys are doing with this podcast.
Oh, thank you. This episode of Planted, Finding Your Roots in STEM Careers, was made possible by the Morton Arboretum and the Multimedia Services at College of DuPage. Check out additional resources and bonus content at www.mortonarb.org/plantedpodcast. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, like, and share, and let us know what you think. This is Jessica Turner-Scuff
and Megan Wiesbrook,
and we hope you'll continue to join us as we journey into STEM careers.